Good evening, everyone. My name is Gabriel Benzikri, and I'm an assistant professor here at Northwood University. Tonight, it is my honor to introduce our esteemed speaker, Dr. Thomas Skinner, who is a senior executive producer at Free to Choose Media and the executive producer of tonight's film, Free to Speak. He's the recipient of numerous honors and awards, including 4 National Emmy Awards. Dr. Skinner was also the director of the Academy Award-winning film, Journey into Self. Throughout his tenure as a senior executive producer at the Free to Choose Media, Dr. Skinner has played a pivotal role in showing the importance of liberty in a way that resonates with the general public. In an era where the Enlightenment principles such as free enterprise and personal responsibility are gradually diminishing in popular culture, Dr. Skinner stands in the forefront of the promotion of these important values, and therefore stands as a strong proponent of the Northwood idea. Dr. Skinner has expertise in a diverse array of productions, many of which explore the lives and ideas of some of our intellectual heroes, including the documentaries on Thomas Sowell, Adam Smith, and Milton Friedman. With an illustrious career, his documentaries have been watched by millions of people, and it is a privilege to have Dr. Skinner with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Thomas Skinner.
Everybody ready for the first day of spring? I come from up north, Traverse City, Suttons Bay area. It's good to be back here. The last time I was here, the university bestowed an honorary doctorate degree on my friend Bob Chittister, who was the founder of Free to Choose Network and who introduced Milton Friedman to television and did lots of things with Milton. Bob, I think, became Milton's surrogate son in many ways. So there's already a bond of some sort between Northwood and Free to Choose. Well, unless you have been living under a rock for the last few years, you're already familiar with the subject of free speech, right? Every day, every newspaper, every magazine, every television show, it's hard to keep up with it. What we're going to do tonight is to watch part of a series that we did. It's on the air now, called Free to Speak. Something like Free to Choose, but Free to Speak. And since my first assignment at Free to Choose, when I went to work for Bob Chittister 25 years ago, was to produce and write the biography of Milton Friedman. Maybe some of you have seen it. It's called Power of Choice. So I thought I'd go back and take a look at Milton's and see what Milton had to say about free speech. And he said, when I asked him, when I did that, I found an old 1993 video and I played it. It was phenomenal. It was just, Milton was sitting there across the table from me at his favorite Italian restaurant in San Francisco, where we went a lot, and was telling me these things. So bear in mind, we're talking about 10, 11 years ago. And Milton said, the single most important virtue is tolerance. He said, one of the most precious things in life is to say what you believe freely and openly without having to worry about too many consequences. And then he said, yeah, there are some consequences. He said, what's important is not only the freedom to speak, but the freedom to listen. And then he said, what's happening now, and remember, this was 10 years ago, he said, what's happening now is not only restrictions on freedom to speak, but freedom to listen. And he said, on college campus after college campus, there's a complete intolerance for speech that's politically incorrect. And he said, it's a disgrace that on university campuses of all places, there is a kind of censorship that's being imposed. And then he said, politically acceptable speech is a terrible term. Politically acceptable speech is a terrible term, a disgraceful term, he said. And finally, he said, we all have very strong opinions and strong beliefs, but you know, there's a chance that I could be wrong because the other fellow thinks that he's right. And I should be free to persuade him of my point of view, and he should be free to persuade me of his point of view, but neither of us should be allowed to coerce the other. And that's Milton. The 3-hour series that we're going to see a little bit of tonight is unprecedented in a lot of ways. Our production team traveled over 300,000 air miles in 2 years to 50 states in 11 countries on 6 continents to conduct interviews and shoot production sequences that helped us tell these stories. Over the 6 months of that, after that, was spent in post-production, and the whole thing happened during the pandemic, which is pretty fantastic. To date, over 350,000 people have watched these programs on YouTube and on the Free to Choose website. 304 public television stations have broadcast the program to about 670,000 estimated viewers. So that's a total in the first year of distribution of about 1 million people who've seen what you're going to see tonight. Our host and narrator is Nadine Strawson, somebody you should get to know. She's a law professor at Columbia, former president of the ACLU, probably knows more about free speech than anybody in the United States. She's a terrific person. And she brought her enthusiasm to the project, and it was great getting to know her. So tonight we're going to see 2 of the openings and 3 segments from each of the programs. And what we'll do is we'll watch one and then we'll stop for about 5 minutes. You can ask questions, make comments, whatever you'd like to do. And then we'll watch the second one, do the same, and we'll watch the third. I'll try to keep track of the time so we're not here all night. So let's go ahead and watch the first one, okay?
Free speech is precarious. It is easy for the government to suppress it, and there will be strong temptations for the government to suppress it.
History shows that whenever authoritarians assume power, free speech is the very first ideal that they will try to curtail.
Long live Big Brother!
The idea that in order to protect your speech, you had to protect the speech of people who would do away with you. It's just like, what?
Free speech has got to be for everybody.
Hate speech is bad. There's no question about it. But the problem is not the speech, it's the hate.
I think the question of what we should do and what we should be allowed to do are 2 very different questions.
Unless you have the ability to voice ideas, you'll never hit on the correct ones.
The most deadly natural disaster in the history of the Western Hemisphere. Somebody just called it, and they were run out of town.
We don't need protections for speech that supports mainstream views. We need protections for minority viewpoints.
He is the newest face of defiance in Hong Kong.
We value the idea that we are going to tolerate discomfort in the name of allowing people to have the potential for revolution.
This was a cell like mine, who sleeps in democracy, wakes up in dictatorship.
Free speech is the ability to express ideas without fear of government intervention. But does absolute free speech exist anywhere? Should it? As a lawyer, law professor, and past president of the ACLU, I've seen that free speech is the fundamental right that gives rise to all manner of social change and progress. But should that freedom include hate speech? We're living in a time when ideas and opinions, including bad ones, can be communicated by just about anyone to more people, more quickly, and more often than ever before. In Germany, where the horrors of Nazism are far from forgotten, hate speech is strictly outlawed.
Well, here in Germany, officials are warning of a rise in far-right extremism.
Across Germany, there's been a 42% increase in violent crime by far-right extremists.
A suspected far-right terrorist has shot dead 11 people near Frankfurt.
A gunman targeting a synagogue on the holy day of Yom Kippur.
A frightening echo of Germany's past.
There is an actual threat where a lot of people are crying for somebody to go and do something, is then leading to somebody going and doing something.
Stefan Ernst was found guilty of shooting dead the politician in what's believed to be Germany's first far-right political assassination since World War II.
His address was published on the internet, and that is how his assassin found him.
There is an absolute radicalization through online communities.
In 2016, Annalena von Hodenburg co-founded Hate Aid to push back against a rising tide of online hate.
Free speech stops where your personality rights are violently evaded. We think it's very, very important to enable people to get justice.
Hate speech is prohibited under the German Criminal Code. Section 130 of the German Criminal Code basically penalizes incitement of hatred, racial hatred, national hatred, religious hatred, or ethnic minorities.
German law criminalizes a range of speech on the rationale that it undermines human dignity.
Laws on hate speech and humiliation and insult are not about protecting feelings. It's upholding everybody's humanity, everybody's status as a person in society. And in that sense, it goes back to Nazi Germany, where certain groups of people, particularly Jewish people, were denied to be human.
We never want this to happen again. Then you won't have any freedom of speech anymore.
German statutes outlaw the public display of Nazi symbols and the support of Nazi ideology.
Swastika? Propaganda material? No. If you want to say the Holocaust never happened, sorry, it's not allowed to say it here.
Certain organizations can't be formed, certain speech can't be heard, but that is in the name of preserving democratic order. Hate speech is a tool for exclusion, a tool for humiliation, which excludes some members of society who are thereby silenced. If activity is capable of inciting racial hatred, we are not going to wait until it actually happens or until it's likely to happen. We are saying already at that point that it shall be prohibited.
United States law takes a different approach.
The core principle of the First Amendment is that the government cannot restrict the expression of a point of view unless extraordinarily grave circumstances exist. The fact that it would, in fact, create grave harm down the road, not good enough.
This principle is the result of a landmark 1969 Supreme Court case, which the court decided unanimously.
Brandenburg against Ohio truly recognizes that free speech means not freedom of thought and speech for those with whom we agree, but freedom of expression for the expression we hate.
Clarence Brandenburg was a vile Ku Klux Klan racist, as vile as they come.
In June of 1964, Clarence Brandenburg held a small KKK rally outside Cincinnati. He invited the local news to cover his speech.
He wanted to eradicate Jews. He wanted to eradicate blacks. He was saying the kind of stuff that, Hitler would have been comfortable with saying. But he was just saying it. He didn't do anything.
The First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. The question is, what is the freedom of speech for the press? What does it include? Does it include hate speech? Does it include advocating violence? It doesn't mean everything. And that opened up this enormous puzzle.
Brandenburg was convicted of criminal syndicalism, or advocating violence. The ACLU appealed the decision and assigned the case to attorney Alan Brown, who had made a name for himself fighting censorship.
In the family, we all understood why my father took the case. For him, the issue was the principal, not the client. In fact, my father's office was interesting. One day I went in there, the Grand Wizard of the Ohio Ku Klux Klan. He's sitting in the front office, right next to the head of the Cincinnati Black Panther Party. Obviously, ideologically, they were poles apart, but legally, they had very similar issues.
The Ohio Supreme Court rejected Brandenburg's appeal. That set the stage for a constitutional battle at the U.S. Supreme Court. A 32-year-old African-American attorney, Eleanor Holmes Norton, signed on to the case.
Yeah, was I a Black woman who was arguing for the rights of white men who wanted to get rid of everybody's speech they could think of.
Besides Eleanor Holmes Norton, the other lawyers that signed off besides my father were also Jewish. So again, not a single white Anglo-Saxon Protestant representing them.
I relished the opportunity to make the case for the First Amendment by arguing in behalf of people with whom I profoundly disagreed.
We were not defending their speech. We were resisting giving the government the power to decide that their speech could be banned. Because once you gave the government the power to decide that their speech could be banned, you also gave the government the power to decide that your speech could be banned.
During the oral argument before the Supreme Court, one exchange in particular highlighted this key concept.
The prosecutor was a guy named Leonard Kirshner, also Jewish. And Kirshner was arguing to the court, and I think he was looking particularly at Thurgood Marshall, and he said what Brandenburg did, it's as if he went into Harlem and started using the N-word.
Bury the Negro. Send them back to Black Africa.
It wouldn't last that long.
Probably so, Your Honor.
My father said, Your Honor, you realize your remark just violated Ohio's Criminal Syndicalism Act.
Justice Marshall, who is safe at the moment because the venue is in Washington, D.C., in Ohio, could be indicted for suggesting a violent reaction by the Negro community.
It made it so clear what was at stake was not Brandenburg, it was free speech.
The court overturned the conviction of a Ku Klux Klansman and declared Ohio's criminal syndicalism law unconstitutional. The ruling said a man cannot be punished merely for what he says if the words are not designed to incite lawlessness.
To stimulate any thought in your mind? Anything you'd like to say? Not to me, but to your fellow students there. It's a very clear case, the difference, isn't it? I mean, between Germany and the United States, it's very clear. And it's, and maybe that's why our courts take so long with things to do these things. But it's, but not, I think that for a lot of viewers, that's a real surprise to see that, you know, that there is that stark difference. And if there is hate speech, as the one guy says, it's not the speech, it's the hate. How do you deal with that? We're going to do a fourth show in this series starting in the spring. Hopefully we'll be in production. And it's going to be on disinformation and the internet, which feeds in to all of this as well. But we start with that because that's really the essential issue. That either, you know, everything is completely open, and it's all not. It's what you say and what you do are two totally different things, which is the American way. Or Germany coming off the experience of the Holocaust and all of that, and that you see these things contemporarily happening in Germany where monuments are defaced and all of that, and there are parades in the streets and so on, and people are bringing back the swastika. And they said the law is more important than that, and so let's just outlaw all of that. So if you display a swastika in Berlin, you don't even get a trial. You go to jail. I mean, and that's the way the Germans are dealing with things today. We, of course, couldn't do that. So therefore, our newspapers, our courts and all that are just full of this every single day. So think about it. I mean, that's the dichotomy. And everything else we do in this first show continues with that whole kind of idea. And there's some absolutely wonderful stories. George Orwell in 1984, where in George Orwell's 1984, he talks about newspeak. Do you know what newspeak is? You know about newspeak? Newspeak is basically, if you can get rid of the word, you can get rid of the meaning behind the word. For example, there's no such word as love in North Korea's language. It doesn't exist. They took the word away, and therefore everything else after it goes away. There's no word for what is it? For confinement and so on, for people being under confinement in North Korea, because everybody's in the workers' paradise. And why would you need a word that defines people being miserable? You don't need that in the language. Well, Orwell does that in 1984, in which he really takes these words out of the vocabulary, and therefore it's not possible to love because there's no word for that. Very interesting. So we pick that up from this and go on with that. Now in this second piece, you're going to see something that is pretty remarkable, because it has to do with what happens with free speech and science. What would happen to science if free speech were outlawed? It has been, sometimes formally, sometimes informally. And in this episode, it's a very interesting story that you probably never heard of, but it's all true and it all happened. And it's because what happened in the scientific community when they said that we're not going to give this guy free speech, we're going to shut him up because he's really off the charts, and we don't need to hear that. It's a fascinating story. So let's play that one.
That's a question.
Yeah.
So from the people that were interviewed defending the German law,
Mm-hmm.
is there any sort of were they worried about the potential issues of regulating speech at all, or do they think that
They think the circumstances. They think the problem is too great to let it grow. I mean, people being shot and all that, carrying on simply because of what somebody said, and somebody found him and shot him and killed him. And they felt that, and all of these Nazi rallies and so on that are having to drum up the whole idea of National Socialism again, and they felt that it was too great a problem before, and we can't let it happen again. So they had a very specific, during the whole 1930s and 40s in Nazi Germany, they had a dramatic example of what Nazism meant. And here they've got people in their own society, in their own cities, speaking up saying, let's do it again. And the German society was such that they said, and she said, no, we're not going to do that. Yeah. Anything else? Let's watch the second one.
Freedom of speech is a crazy idea. The notion that the people should be allowed to say things that seem disgusting or blasphemous or seditious or bigoted or hateful, this is deeply antithetical to who we are as human beings. And the only thing going for this loony idea is that it's also the most successful social idea of all time, bar none.
Freedom of expression, it's not just the words that come out of your mouth, it's the books you read, it's what you wear.
L'école publique restera laïque.
Là-bas, on l'impose aux femmes, et ici, on veut nous l'enlever.
Free speech, it's absolutely unnatural. The first impulse is to self-censor because it's dangerous.
An urgent manhunt for the two gunmen responsible for the terror attack that stunned Paris
If I see him, who did the cartoon about Muhammad, if I see him, I kill him.
When you believe in different things, then you will have conflicts.
If people are afraid to run ideas past each other, they can't move forward.
These gentlemen have no other purpose than ridiculing every Christian.
And if you tell somebody you can't talk about this, I think that's censorship.
All ideas should be subject to criticism because no one is infallible.
Genetics was banned because it was fake science.
Who are these two doctors there? We've never heard of them. They couldn't really admit that they had been on the wrong track.
Whether it's scientific, religious, the more free we can make the conversation among human beings, the better off we'll be.
Free speech. It's essential for social change and progress, and that includes science and religion, areas where human understanding and beliefs are frequently at odds, where thinking can, and often does, become dogmatic. So how does free expression shape those areas of our lives? Throughout my career as lawyer, law professor, and past president of the ACLU, I've seen that the right to free speech is essential for exercising every other right, and that censorship is the greatest threat to those rights. Free and open discourse is important not only for reconciling conflicts between religion and science, but also within science itself.
It's a real problem with science that in theory it's open to changing its mind. The whole point of science is you change your mind if the facts change. But in practice, science often behaves more like religion in this respect. If you say, on this we know we're right, and you can't deviate from the right view, and you therefore prevent free speech in the form of disagreement, then you prevent scientific advance. The story of Barry Marshall and stomach ulcers is a very good example of dogma getting in the way of scientific progress.
Now there it is, Steve, that irregular bulge there. You've got a duodenal ulcer.
Duodenal ulcer?
The commonest type.
It used to be that 10% of everybody in the United States would get an ulcer at some time in their life.
They come to the unlucky guy with a nervous system that pumps acid into his stomach, even when there isn't any food there to digest.
A stomach ulcer is a little hole in the lining of the stomach, can be quite painful, and potentially some of them can get quite bad.
For decades, thousands of Americans had been bleeding to death from severe stomach ulcers every year.
Because people didn't know the cause of ulcers, they said it's caused by too much acid. And the reason you have too much acid is because you're under stress. Nobody bothered to look for another cause.
In 1981, pathologist Robin Warren made a life-changing discovery.
Normally, if people had any kind of stomach problem, you would put the fiber optic endoscope with a little camera on it and look around in the stomach to see if people had an ulcer. But Dr. Warren took some biopsy samples, looked at them under the microscope, and he started seeing these bacteria in the stomach. The weird thing was that all the medical books said bacteria could not live in the stomach because there's so much acid there.
The major difficulties that I had at the time were that no one believed them. And then Barry Marshall walked into my room and asked to see what I was doing. And since he was the only person who'd ever shown any real interest in what I was doing, I showed him.
He said to me, there seems to be bacteria in the stomach. What do they mean? It was only a year later that when we looked at our data on about 100 people that we could say, there might be something here. Everybody with ulcers has got these bacteria and nobody noticed them before. Maybe the bacteria damages the lining of the stomach and then the acid eats a hole in it. That would make sense.
The doctor's discovery of the Helicobacter pylori bacteria could change the way stomach ulcers were treated with antibiotics instead of acid blockers.
In the 80s when we started, everyone with ulcers was being put on these acid blocker tablets. Most gastroenterologists and physicians, they had gone from having virtually no treatment for ulcers to having acid blockers. So as far as they were concerned, these drugs were magical. The problem was that they did not cure you. They would just heal the ulcer. And if you stopped taking the treatment, a month later, your ulcer would come back. The big pharmaceutical companies could see that it was a gold mine. So by 1987, actually, they were selling $5 billion worth of the main drugs. A friend of mine coined the term acid mafia. So everyone was so focused on acid and acid blockers, they couldn't really admit that they had been on the wrong track. Robin and I had been doing this work for a couple of years. We were starting to get pretty interested. So we submitted our initial research paper to the Australian Gastroenterology meeting, and it was rejected. I did present it a year later, and still nobody believed it. Who are these two doctors there? We've never heard of them. This is strange stuff. I'm going to reject it. People were standing up in the audience saying, Barry, you've got this wrong.
When you tried to say it at conferences or publish it in scientific journals, the allergic reaction among the scientific establishment was very strong.
In order to be taken seriously, Marshall and Warren needed to prove that H. pylori bacteria caused ulcers in live animals.
We tried it on guinea pigs and rabbits and rats. No luck. They were immune to these bacteria, so we decided to do a human experiment. And after some discussion with Dr. Warren, we decided that I was going to be the guinea pig. I had to see if a healthy person could be infected. I took the bacteria from a patient who had gastritis or inflammation in the stomach, cultured the bacteria. It was a Tuesday morning in July 1984. I drank 1,000 million of these bacteria. I kind of felt unwell for a few days. Then I started throwing up each morning. I had this bad breath and I was not sleeping. I was breaking out in sweats. So we put the scope down and took some biopsies. And sure enough, I had a very, very thick infection with these bacteria in the stomach. And on the biopsy, we saw exactly the kind of inflammation that we saw in the ulcer patients.
It was that self-experimentation, which was a brave and painful thing to do, that eventually began to persuade the world that he was right.
In 2005, the same scientific community that had rejected their findings honored Marshall and Warren with the Nobel Prize in Medicine.
Against prevailing dogmas, you discovered that one of the most common and important diseases of mankind now can be permanently cured by antibiotics to the benefit of millions of patients.
Finally, could be added, the work that is awarded was performed more than 20 years ago.
20 years. So is that a long time? Too long, but compared to how long bad ideas hang around, it's the blink of an eye. Science makes its mistakes incredibly quickly. I mean, it throws up millions of hypotheses every day, the vast majority of which will be wrong. And then it finds its mistakes incredibly quickly. It sorts through those haystacks to find those needles and then circulate those needles through the community and then do it all again the next day.
Someone else who hates you has to do the experiment and get the same result. And they say, well, I used to hate that theory, but I tested it out and it really seems to be true. You can look at the evidence and the way it was collected and the way it was proven or disproven, and you can say, that seems believable.
We now have hundreds of years of accumulated objective knowledge. Now, some of that will turn out to be wrong. Anything that's settled can be unsettled in liberal science. That's one of its core principles. It's called fallibilism. You might always be wrong. That's why we need free speech.
That's a great story. I mean, and it's just so, I can remember my father having an ulcer and taking all those pills. And of course, the drug companies are getting rich beyond belief. And that doesn't happen anymore. And that's because there was finally, after 20 years, free speech. But we do the same in the same show where we're doing science. We also do religion. We do the story of Galileo, who was condemned. locked up for the rest of his life because they said he had all the wrong ideas. And all he was saying simply was that the earth moves around the sun. It's not the other way around. And the church says, we don't want anybody to hear about that. We don't want to talk about that. So they locked him up for the rest of life, and that was the end of Galileo. And what if instead they had said, let's have a discussion about that. Let's kind of get that out in the open and find out which way, who's right here. And there are lots and lots of those, kinds of stories. Got any thoughts or anything you want to say about this one? The Russians did much the same thing, with when Stalin and Khrushchev were in power in the Soviet Union, and they had all these geneticists who were really pretty smart, award-winning geneticists, and they put them all in the gulags. Most of them died, and they followed this rules of this other guy, this idea that you could train wheat, and as a result, thousands of people died in the Soviet Union. After that, thousands of people died in China because China used the same techniques of trying to say that, well, we can train this wheat to be what it isn't. And the geneticists who knew the difference were all done away with. And they all went to the gulags. And as a result, many, many people died as a result of that. Okay, anything else? Gabriel, anything?
Yeah, was there any conversation about the pandemic? Because during the pandemic, we saw that.
We do the pandemic. Yeah, we do a little bit. We do the story of the young guy young doctor who said that he thought that he was finding SARS, and he said there's this problem in this market and so on, and he alerted everybody. He was 37 years old, and he alerted everybody, and nobody believed him, and then he got sick. And he had COVID, and he died in the hospital. And so that whole business, and the whole business of the whole COVID story, and so on, the secretism that the Chinese kind of kept it all under the bed, is the reason why a lot of people died. I mean, plain and simple. There's a wonderful book by the woman who invented CRISPR. It's that book called, and it's about that kind of science, that you can't keep it quiet. And the scientific community is incredible, the way it works, the way laboratories work, and young people like you will move from one laboratory to another because they want to follow this researcher, or they want to follow what's happening with this particular disease. It's a really interesting phenomenon. It happens all over this country. And it's because science needs to be open in order for these to happen. Here's a segment from the last of the 3 shows.
The wide availability of new and varied ideas, along with the desire to curb them, was greatly impacted by the invention of a specific machine, the Gutenberg press.
When Time magazine went through its list of what is the most important invention, the answer was the printing press. It's the physical machine used to press the printing letters, the type letters, into paper, which sounds like something simple, but getting a machine to accomplish that and then be replicated, that's the secret of changing the world.
It allowed people to have concepts written down and shared and shared and shared. And that's why really the press became so threatening.
Before that machine came about with Gutenberg's development and invention, books are written by hand. That process, a Bible takes 3 to 5 years to finish. Gutenberg was born somewhere around 1398, and around him is swirling the beginnings of the Reformation and the Renaissance, which means there's a demand for more books. And Gutenberg's approach to that problem wasn't so much, I need to invent a new technology, a new machine. His approach was, I need to write books faster. Gutenberg creates a process that replicates books in such quantities that the price just keeps dropping. Within 50 years of Gutenberg, it's hard to imagine how many books were printed. 12 million books in the first 50 years. All the books written by hand during Gutenberg's lifetime by all the scribes in Europe that number is probably around 20,000. Now you begin to think about the difference between 20,000 and 12 million. The world changes.
Once the printing press became available and it became possible to spread concepts, then there was an urge to also suppress the things that are on paper. And I mean, one of the really interesting things about any kind of recorded form is that as soon as there's a recorded form, people start using it for sex. And this is one of the things that certainly threatened the authorities that be, because if you have sexual disruption, you have social disruption. And so some of the earliest censorship was not just of concepts, it was of sexual issues.
There's a growing movement to remove or restrict certain books in libraries, including school libraries. And this is hardly America's first brush with book bans. In 1939, an Illinois library burned The Grapes of Wrath. In 1960, a teacher in Oklahoma was fired for assigning The Catcher in the Rye. Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover, Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, James Joyce's Ulysses. All of these have been censored. And still more books are being banned today.
There is talk of banning 16 books in Polk County Public Schools.
Activists demanding that the library ban more than 400 books.
We need an audit of the library and for pornographic and sexual content.
People ban books or seek to ban books or keep them out of libraries or keep them out of the hands of the public because whatever's in there is considered by them to be offensive. They think that they can somehow solve the world by limiting what knowledge people have.
And that's why a lot of these things happen in schools, because if the kids see this book, if the kids see this painting, if the kids listen to this music, trying to protect the children becomes a very powerful intoxicant.
Collierville School is under fire after pulling books from the school library.
At our school, we go to Collierville High School, there were about 300 books that were pulled off the shelves within the first month of school, most of them having to do with Black Lives Matter movements and LGBTQ plus communities.
For the most part, the parents that we work with, they don't look at this as banning books. What books are available to children now in schools, families believe are either age inappropriate or content inappropriate, and they have raised questions about that. More than anything, families want to know what their children have access to and have a little bit of oversight into that process.
I don't think that anyone should have the power to pull a book off and impact another student's education if they're not your own.
These two students helped form the Tennessee Youth Coalition to lobby against book banning legislation in their state.
The one that we did the most work on was House Bill, Senate Bill 1944, and that prohibits the existence of obscene materials in our classrooms, both classroom libraries and school libraries. Obscene is something that's going to be different for everybody. I'm not entirely sure what my own definition is. I don't have the same beliefs a lot of the time as my mom, but my education should be up to me and my mom, not like a school-wide decision made by one single person.
Who has oversight into what books are in a school library that children are reading, have access to, or being assigned as curriculum? For that to be done by, administrators behind closed doors, I think is worrisome to people, and I think with good reason.
We're not trying to promote inappropriate things. We're not promoting risky behavior or indoctrinating people. What we're doing is we're presenting a global view. And I think we do students a disservice when we try to narrow that lens.
So, are there limits on a school's power to ban books? The Supreme Court addressed that important question for the first and only time in 1982.
3 members of the Island Tree School Board attend a conference in upstate New York.
They learned about books that were being challenged and questioned in other parts of the country. And on a table, they said they found a list entitled Objectionable Books.
They come back from the conference, and 2 of the school board members persuade the school custodian to open the library, and they go through the card catalog.
The board removed these 11 books from the school system.
These were not books that were part of the curriculum that the kids were being required to read. These were books in the library, in the school library, that kids could take out or not take out as they wished. These were books like Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, The Naked Ape by Desmond Morris, which was a book on zoology.
A Native American Love Story, 2 books by Jewish authors. Half of the books have to do with the greatest Black American writers. Why are these books on the list?
Because they are anti-American, anti-Christian, anti-Semitic, and just plain filthy. That comes right out of their press release.
We had been taught over and over again that book burning occurs in fascist countries like Nazi Germany, that book banning only occurs in totalitarian and authoritarian regimes that we oppose around the world. I decided to take the board to court for violating my constitutional rights, as well as the constitutional rights and the First Amendment rights of teachers, educators, librarians, and all the other students.
Stephen Pico and 4 other students filed a lawsuit against the Island Trees School Board and won. The school board appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court.
We'll hear arguments next in Board of Education against Pico.
What is the motivation behind the book banning? That's what the whole case came down to.
We argued that school officials could not remove books simply because they disliked the ideas contained in those books.
If they remove the book solely because it contains a passage that offends a particular group in the community, then the First Amendment is concerned.
The Island Trees Board of Education changed their argument. They said, this really wasn't about political motive. These books contain vulgarity. One justice, Justice Stevens, reminded the school board attorney that one of these books contained no vulgarity at all.
No vulgarity at all in that book.
Their feeling is
So
that
the banning of that book cannot be justified on vulgarity grounds.
that is correct. They felt it was in bad taste.
Now, what is the ground for banning? It's just bad taste. Would it be permissible for them to take every book out of the library they thought was in bad taste? What does bad taste mean?
4 justices vote for us, 4 justices vote for the school board, and Justice White, the deciding judge, rejects the school board position and basically says the case should be sent back for a trial inquiring into the motive of the school board, rather than go to trial to explain how and why they banned books. The school board restored the books to the shelves. Our system of free expression is dependent upon pluralism and a multiplicity of viewpoints.
I think books are the foundation for our democracy. I just think it's the cornerstone of everything. Ideas and thoughts and points of view. I think when we start putting limiters on voice and we put limiters on perspective and inclusion, I think that's a slippery slope.
The PICO legal team successfully resisted the ban, but the court stressed that its ruling was confined to that particular case. So the PICO decision hasn't always provided specific guidance for future cases, but it at least stands for one key principle. You can't remove books purely on political grounds. In 2021, the court reaffirmed the importance of a student's free speech rights, even regarding controversial ideas, by an 8-1 vote. It said, America's public schools are the nurseries of democracy. Our representative democracy only works if we protect the marketplace of ideas.
Do you have thoughts about that? And have you bumped into that particular issue in your own library? You're laughing? Yes, no?
Well, I grew up in Brazil. We don't have much free speech there. So many books were banned.
Yeah, many books were banned. Yeah. But it's interesting when you see this, like go back to the first episode, and you see the Brandenburg case versus German law. It's really two sides of the same coin. It's all about free speech, 2 totally different ways of looking at it. Here with banned books, it's the same kind of thing. I mean, it's a matter, and a lot of it has to do with control. Somebody, I think, Ira says that in the show somewhere. It's really about feeling that you need to control things, and you need to have. And what happens if this kid reads this or that? And are they going to go out and rob the 7-Eleven because they read about that in a book? And there's a book that I would recommend to all of you, and it's new within the last year, and it's called The Canceling of the American Mind, and it's by Greg Lukianoff. He might have been here at some point, he's head of fire. It's an incredible book, and it tells you what's going on, not here, I'm sure, but on campuses all over the United States, in terms of not only do some students say we should be protected from bad ideas, we shouldn't debate bad ideas and come out where we think is right, we should be protected. And I think the sadder thing is there are a lot of parents who think their kids should be protected and not be exposed. And that's why you have trigger warnings and you have all these other things that are going on, where somebody says, I'm going to assign this book to you, but in chapter 13, these nasty things happen. You might want to skip over that. It might upset you. Well, I think you're old enough to decide whether that would upset you or not. Anyway, it's been a fascinating series to do. A lot of interesting problems in it. There's always, making television shows is never easy. This whole idea was hatched when Bob Chittister was still alive, as many years ago. Bob and I decided that the ideal host for this series was P.J. O'Rourke. You know him? You read his stuff? Eat the Rich, so on. So basically he's a comedian, but he's a wonderful writer. And we were going to take him all over the world and do these things. It was all set, it was all laid out and so on. He called us one day. He'd been diagnosed with brain cancer and he was dead in 3 weeks. So we had to punt and start basically all over. And then the pandemic happened. So it's somewhat of a miracle that we have this show on the air at this point. But that's what you have to do if you're in this business. You have to learn how to punt. So, yes?
Did you get to go to college campuses to see, like many events are shut down in college campuses by students and even parts of faculty?
Oh, yeah, and we deal with that. Yeah, we did. It's pretty amazing. I mean, the free speech movement, where did this free speech movement start? Somebody know? The free speech movement in the United States started at University of California at Berkeley, Vietnam War. The kids were protesting the Vietnam War. There's a guy named Mario Savio, who's in the first episode, later on in the first episode. I hope you'll look at all these, by the way. You can see them on YouTube or you can see them on freetochoose.org and at your leisure. But Mario Savio and the kids were protesting the Vietnam War. And that was in the 1960s. Now what's happening on college campuses is at Berkeley, they're burning down the entranceway of the lecture hall because they think this guy who has crazy ideas should not give a speech. And there have been other things like that in various colleges and campuses. And the irony is these same young people who were behind the free speech movement and saying, we want to hear everything and we want to protest the Vietnam War and don't shut us down. We're going to say whatever we please. Those same people are today saying, I don't want to hear that. It's not good for me. Not good for me to hear that stuff. There's some really crazy things that have happened over the last, from the 60s till now, and are now, it's now kind of in full bloom of all of this stuff happening, right? Anyway, I thank you all for coming, and I thank all the people who helped make this. Kip Perry and Ilan Bentov, who are now off doing a program on the cost of the military in the United States. We're calling it the cost of war, and it's basically an analysis of what it costs to have a volunteer military. We spend more on the creation of a voluntary military than any other expenditure in the United States except Social Security. And as we take that apart as to why that's so, it's kind of interesting. It's interesting stuff. Anyway, they've done a terrific job on this. My co-executive producer at Free to Choose, working with me on this, and our staff and all that. Remember what the guy said in the very beginning of the first show. One who sleeps in democracy wakes up in dictatorship. He was put in prison behind the Berlin Wall. And there's a whole story about him and that in the show. If you sleep in democracy, you wake up in dictatorship. Have a good night.